The college football playoffs are officially set, and we now know who the 4 teams that are going to be competing for the college football playoffs. But with every college football selection show, there's going to be controversy, and I think this year sums that up better than ever. So in this video, I want to give you guys my opinion on the college football playoff selections, as well as I want to go ahead and predict who's going to win each game. But without further ado, let's hop into it. So in case you live under a shell and don't actually know who's going to be in the playoffs, at number 4 is Alabama, number 3 Texas, number 2 Washington, and number 1 Michigan. And the 2 teams that are not going to be in the college football playoffs that a lot of people think should have been in the playoffs is Georgia at 6 and FSU at 5. Now when you look at the resume, each of these teams genuinely deserves a chance to go out there and make the playoffs. Georgia was a 12-1 non-conference champion, but a back-to-back college football playoff winner. Florida State probably has the best case to be in this conversation because they went undefeated and are a conference champion, but their starting quarterback Jordan Travis out for the season. Alabama, 12-1 conference champion, just beat the back-to-back champions. And then there's Texas, who is also 12-1, winner of the Big 12, beat Alabama, so I think it makes sense that Bama and Texas kind of were a 1-2 duo. In my opinion, you could not have put Alabama in the playoffs if you did not put Texas in. I know everyone says that Bama's a different team now than they were then, but are they really though? It's the same players who Texas beat that just went up against Georgia. Sure, their schemes were different, the way they play football is different. I agree. I'm just kind of pulling your collar here. I think Texas had to have the head-to-head over Bama to get above them, and they did. Had Bama lost to another team not named Texas, I actually think Bama would probably be number 3 and Texas would probably be number 4. But because they scheduled Texas and Texas went out there into their hometown and beat them by 10 points, they had to be in front of them. But the Bama-Texas stuff is not much of a conversation anymore because the conversation is really all directed at why is Florida State not in the college football playoffs? At the end of the day, they have a point. 13-0 conference champion, that's pretty damn good. And at the end of the day, they could not have done anything more to prove their case they should be in the playoffs. And even though the committee says we're not going to pick the 4 most deserving teams, we're going to pick the 4 best teams, I kind of think they kind of are lying there. I think they're picking from the 4 most deserving teams, they're picking the 4 best of the most deserving teams. If that makes sense. And in this conversation, the 6 teams that were laid out are the most deserving, so you're going to pick which 4 are the best of those 6. But you also have to add context. Bama beat Georgia, Texas beat Bama, so you can't put Georgia above those 2 teams. We already knew that Michigan and Washington were essentially locked, so we don't really have to talk about them a whole lot. The conversation really comes down to the bottom 4 teams. And me personally, I think they got it right. At the end of the day, if FSU would have been in this conversation, let's be honest, they would have been double-digit underdogs to any team on the board. And yes, Florida State has a championship-level defense, but so does Texas, so does Bama, so does Georgia, so does Michigan, so does Washington. To me, that does not elevate them any higher than where they're at number 5. I'd even make the argument that I think I'd rather see a non-conference champion in Georgia, who is very, very, very good and honestly might still be the best team in the country, be in the playoffs over FSU. Because FSU does not have a starting quarterback, and as long as you have no starting quarterback, you should not be in the conversation for the college football playoffs. I know some people are going to be like, well, Max Duggan last year led TCU into the playoffs and look how that went. And sure, but that was a different series with a different amount of teams. I believe Bama lost 2 games last year. We have conference champions with 1 loss, and you're going to keep them out just because Florida State's in there. In my opinion, that's not how the game should work, and they think they did the right thing. At the end of the day, the committee had the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, which was Jordan Travis's injury. Whenever people would ask them, why'd you leave FSU out? Well, Jordan Travis got injured. And that was very, very, very simple for them. It was a very simple concept for me to understand. I think they probably said the same thing too when they were discussing who should be in. They had the excuse for one team, and that team was Florida State. Because had you put Bama over Texas and put FSU in, and Texas was left out, Texas would throw a riot, and rightfully so. The same thing can be said about Alabama. Had Alabama been left out of the playoffs, we just beat the number 1 team in the country. How are we not a top 4 team in the nation? So for Florida State to be moved down to number 5, I just think it makes the most logical sense. I'm not sure if you guys watched their game against Louisville, but it was hard to watch. The final score was 16-6, and that offense was horrible. They did not score 16 points. The defense put them in position to score 16 points over and over and over again. And listen, that Florida State defense is legit. They have NFL guys from top to bottom, and some of those guys are better than what we see in this college football playoffs. Like, I'd make the argument that FSU's defense is probably better than Texas, and I don't think that's that crazy. But when you compare everything else about their team to a team like Texas, let's say, it's not comparable. And I think they made the right move. At the end of the day, Texas going in against Washington is going to be a close matchup. Florida State, had they got in and played Washington, it would be a blowout more than likely. At the end of the day, Louisville was unable to really prove that they could beat a team like Florida State, and ultimately, Louisville's not that great of a team. Like, Texas blew out Oklahoma State, and I think Oklahoma State probably could have beat Louisville. Now, ultimately, to kind of round things out here, I think they did make the right move. At the end of the day, it's the 4 best deserving teams in my opinion. Sure, FSU is undefeated, and they have a very, very strong case, and honestly, I would not have been terribly mad if they did put them in. But when you're starting your second string quarterback who has not proven that he's anything better than what we have in these college football playoff teams, I don't think you could be put in. Because ultimately, the quarterback position is by far the most important position in the entire NFL and college football landscape. And it just so happens that Florida State lost their quarterback and he's not going to come back. And when you look at the rest of the college football playoff landscape, there was too many great teams to be left out. And had they done that, people would have thrown riots. At the end of the day, the decision, in my opinion, was correct. And I know some people are going to disagree, but I think they made the right decision. As for my predictions, and I want to get through this kind of quickly so I don't waste too much of your time here, we have Texas versus Washington and Bama versus Michigan. I'll talk about the Bama game first. And I'll start this off by saying this. I think Jalen Milroe, the quarterback for Alabama, is probably the worst quarterback of the top 4 teams. I think right now his fundamental mindset when playing football is to be more of a run-first guy. Now, what Jalen Milroe does have is he's a freak athlete who has a cannon of an arm. He's not the most accurate and his decision making is not very precise, but when things are open, he will deliver the ball in the right place at the right time. But don't expect him to go out there and make really quick decisions. So I think if you're the defense for Michigan, I think you go out there and stop his first read and force him to run the ball. And if I'm Michigan, I'm having my most freakish athletic safety or linebacker or defensive lineman, whoever you want to put out there, to spy on Jalen Milroe, and whenever he gets out of the pocket, put pressure on him, force him to run the ball. You have to make Jalen Milroe Superman in my opinion, and I don't think Georgia did a very good job of making him be Superman. They allowed other players and themselves to impact the outcome of the game, and Jalen Milroe was just kind of facilitating and just doing a very good job of being precise with where he threw it and ran it. Michigan, in my opinion, is a better defense than Georgia. I know that might seem a little rash, maybe at this point a little bit recency bias, but I do think Michigan has a genuinely great defense. But I'll say this, outside of Ohio State, Michigan really has not went up against a very good team. And I'm not quite sure if they've ever really went up against a Russian quarterback this year. I could be wrong, I didn't watch every Michigan game, but I'm not sure if they really have. I guarantee you they have not went up against a quarterback like Jalen Milroe at least, because Jalen is genuinely faster than a lot of running backs in the college football playoffs right now. So I think the matchup of the mindset of the Michigan defense versus the mindset of the Alabama offense is going to be a very interesting dynamic. And as we now go on to the Michigan offensive side of things, I think Bama has a bit of an advantage there. Bama's defensive line is huge, and ultimately they can stuff the run pretty effectively. They don't have the best defensive line, I think right now Texas probably has that, but they have the pieces and the players to create pressure, to slow down different people. I think ultimately Alabama has an advantage there. So I think it's really going to come down to, can Michigan effectively pass the ball with JJ McCarthy? Right now, their mindset is basically to run the ball with Blake Corum. Hell, against Ohio State, they barely passed the ball in the second half. Against Alabama and against their scheme and the way they do things, they're going to have to pass the ball to have some effectiveness. This was a much worse matchup than them going up against FSU, so I do kind of feel bad for Michigan, but ultimately at the same time, I'm happy. And I'll be honest with you guys, I don't really believe in JJ McCarthy. I do think he's the 3rd worst quarterback in the entire playoffs right now. And with the secondary that Alabama does have, I think they're going to give JJ McCarthy a very, very hard time. And when we look at the head coaches, you got Harbaugh versus Saban. You tell me, they're both really good coaches. So I'm going to give you guys my prediction. I'm going to guess 31 Alabama, 27 Michigan. I have Alabama with the upset at the number 4 versus number 1 seed. Now we move on to Washington versus Texas, a rematch of a bowl game just a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And in that game, Washington did win, but Texas was without a lot of their key guys during that time, and they're also a much different team today than they were then. Now both of these teams are extremely battle tested. Washington obviously has their 2 matchups against Oregon. They've also had some really tough matchups against teams like USC. And whereas Texas has obviously been battle tested with matchups like Alabama, Kansas State, Iowa State, Oklahoma. And in all those games, Texas played pretty well. Of course, they lost to Oklahoma, but that was a game-winning play that Oklahoma made, so ultimately, it's not that bad of a loss. Washington has the advantage at the quarterback position, but I think Texas has a lot of advantages in a lot of other positions. Running back-wise, I think Texas has a bit of an advantage in terms of their depth and the way they use them. Offensive line-wise is pretty equal, but Texas has so much cohesiveness on that offensive line right now that they can protect Quinn Ewers for miles and miles at a time. Receiving core is, in my opinion, basically dead split. Texas has 2 receivers that are going to go in the NFL, and so does Washington. I think Washington might have the better playmaker, so I'm going to go with Washington. When it comes to defense, the defensive line for Texas is absolutely monstrous. T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy are a 1-2 combination that nobody wants to deal with. And don't look now, but the secondary for Texas has been taking some strides as of late. Manny Muhammad is one of the best young cornerbacks in the entire college football playoff landscape. I do think, though, that Washington has a slight advantage in the secondary, but I don't think they're ultimately good enough to slow down a Texas offense. I think it's really going to come down to 2 players. Quinn Ewers, Michael Penix Jr. Very simple. And for Texas, it's going to be, can you force this Washington Huskies team to be one-dimensional? Can you slow down the run game and force them to pass the ball over the field? And when they do pass the ball, can you create some turnovers? Because right now, with the way that Texas is playing, I don't think any defense can slow down Texas right now. So to make my prediction, I'm going to give Texas 48, Washington 44. Am I just making numbers up in my head? Probably. Then we have the rematch between Texas and Alabama, and Texas obviously won that one earlier this year, and I kind of think that follows suit again. Texas has the defense to slow down a rushing quarterback. They've proved that time and time again. I don't really think there's a whole lot to talk about here because Texas is already matched up very well against Alabama. Is Alabama a different team today than they were back in week 2? Yes, 100%. But Texas beat them by 10 in their hometown and embarrassed them in front of their crowd. I think Texas does that again, and I think it's kind of a very similar game again, maybe besides the turnovers for Jalen Milroe. I think offensively, Texas is better today than they are then, and I also think Texas defensively is better today than they are then. Both of these teams have elevated their play in recent years, and I think Texas can beat a team like Alabama. So in my opinion, Texas wins with a very similar score of 27-24. And ultimately, your Texas Longhorns are college football playoff champions. But that is going to conclude my video. If you guys do agree with my opinions, let me know in the comment section below. And if you disagree, let me know your opinions right now. As well as while you're down there, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button because that helps me out a ton. But I love you guys. Peace.